The great doors of the throne hall boomed shut before anyone could stop them, and every head in the room turned toward the sound. Elena Voss stood frozen in the center of the marble floor, her heart slamming against her ribs, her own voice still echoing in her ears. She had just said the two words that no one in the history of the kingdom had dared to say to a reigning Alpha King. "I reject you." Damien Ashford did not move. He stood on the raised platform where moments earlier he had been crowned before his entire court, his crimson cloak still settling against his shoulders, his hands still loosely fisted at his sides from the ceremony. But his eyes, which had been a deep and ordinary brown only seconds before, now burned with a molten gold that seemed to light the shadows of the hall. The temperature in the room seemed to drop, though nothing had physically changed except the air itself, thick and crackling, as if lightning were about to strike. Elena had not planned any of this. She had been standing at the very back of the crowd, wedged between broad shoulders and unfamiliar faces, brought to the coronation only because her pack elder insisted that every wolf in the region attend the ceremony where the new king's mate bond, if one existed, would be revealed to the kingdom. She had expected nothing. She was nobody, a low-ranked wolf from a pack so small and so poor that most of the kingdom did not know its name. She had come only because refusing to attend would have brought shame on her family. Then Damien had turned, scanning the crowd as tradition demanded, searching for the pull that every unmated Alpha King was said to feel the moment he stood before his people as a crowned ruler. And the pull had found her. It struck her like a rope thrown across a canyon, an invisible line snapping taut between her chest and his, so sudden and so violent that she had gasped aloud and stumbled backward into the wolf behind her. The crowd had begun to murmur immediately, heads turning, eyes searching for the source of the king's reaction. Someone pointed, someone gasped, and then, before the herald could even announce what had happened, before the king himself could step down from the platform, Elena had spoken. The words had come out of her before she had time to think them through, driven by pure fear rather than any real plan. "I reject you." Now the hall was silent, except for the low growl building somewhere deep in the king's chest, a sound that vibrated through the floor and up through the soles of Elena's boots. The gold in his eyes did not fade. If anything, it deepened, swirling like liquid metal, and the massive iron doors at the back of the hall groaned once more, as though some force beyond ordinary hands had tested their locks and found them secure. Elena realized, with a cold drop of understanding, that she was trapped inside a room with an Alpha King she had just publicly humiliated, and there was no way out. The silence stretched unbearably. Courtiers along the walls shifted uneasily, none of them daring to speak first. An older woman in deep blue robes, who Elena would later learn was the king's advisor, stepped forward with her hands raised in a calming gesture, though her voice trembled slightly when she finally spoke. "Your Majesty, the ceremony can be paused. Perhaps the girl is simply overwhelmed." Damien did not look at his advisor. His gaze remained fixed on Elena, pinning her in place more effectively than any physical restraint could have. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled, though the effort it took him to keep it that way was obvious in the tightness of his jaw. "Say it again," he said. "Say it to my face, and mean it, if you truly mean it." Elena's mouth went dry. Every wolf in the pack system knew the old stories about rejected bonds, how the pain of a broken mate connection could drive an alpha to madness, how kings in ages past had torn kingdoms apart in their grief and fury after a rejection. She had grown up hearing these stories as warnings, cautionary tales, meant to frighten young wolves into never speaking those words carelessly. She had never imagined she would be the one to say them, and certainly never to a king. "I don't know you," she managed to say, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be, though she forced herself to hold his gaze. "I don't want this. I don't want any of this." A ripple of shock moved through the crowd. No one refused a king. No one, especially not a wolf from an insignificant, unranked pack, dared to say such a thing to the man who now held the fate of the entire kingdom in his hands. Elena felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on her, felt the way the air itself seemed to hum with tension, and for a moment she thought she might simply collapse under the pressure of it. Damien's jaw worked once, twice, and then, remarkably, the growl in his chest quieted. The gold in his eyes did not fade, but something in his posture shifted, the aggressive tension replaced by something colder and more calculating. He stepped down from the platform slowly, deliberately, and the crowd parted before him like water breaking around a stone. He stopped a few feet from Elena, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him, close enough that her wolf, the instinctive animal part of her that lived beneath her human skin, whimpered and pressed forward against her will, drawn to him, despite everything her mind was screaming at her to run. "You do not understand what you have done," he said quietly, his voice pitched only for her now, though she suspected everyone in the front rows could still hear. "A rejection is not a door you can close and walk away from. It is a wound, and wounds like this one do not heal on their own terms. They heal on the terms of pack law." "What does that mean?" Elena asked, though part of her did not want to know the answer. "It means," Damien said, straightening to his full height, "that until the bond fades naturally, which can take months, or until it is properly severed through the old rites, which require both parties to stand before the Pack Council, you are under my protection. You will remain in this castle. You will not leave the kingdom's borders, and you will give me the chance to understand why my own mate looked at me and saw someone worth running from." Elena's stomach dropped. "This is not a punishment," she said, though it sounded exactly like one. "It is not," Damien agreed, his gold eyes finally softening by the smallest degree, though the fire in them did not fully extinguish. "It is survival. For both of us. A broken bond left untreated can kill. I have seen it happen to others. I do not intend to let it happen to either of us, because you were afraid of a title." Elena wanted to argue that it was not the title she feared, but she could not find the words. How could she explain, to a king she had known for less than an hour, that the very idea of belonging to someone with power terrified her down to the marrow of her bones? How could she tell him that the golden fire she now saw in his eyes reminded her, in the worst possible way, of another Alpha's eyes from years ago, eyes that had watched her childhood home burn? The advisor in blue robes cleared her throat gently. "Your Majesty, perhaps it would be wise to continue this conversation somewhere more private. The court has much to discuss regarding the succession, and the girl looks as though she may faint." Damien's gaze flicked briefly toward his advisor, and something like reluctant agreement passed between them. He turned back to Elena, and for just a moment, before he masked it again, she saw something raw beneath the authority and the golden fire, something that looked almost like hurt. "Mira," he said, raising his voice slightly, and a young woman near the edge of the crowd stepped forward immediately, dressed in the simple gray uniform of the castle staff. "See that Lady Elena is given quarters near the east wing. Treat her as an honored guest, not a prisoner, but she is not to leave the castle grounds without an escort." Mira bowed her head. "Yes, Your Majesty." Elena wanted to protest, wanted to demand that someone explain what right anyone had to keep her here against her will, but the look on Damien's face told her that this was not a decision open to negotiation. Not today. The doors at the back of the hall, which had slammed shut and locked themselves the moment she spoke her rejection, now clicked open on their own, as though whatever force had sealed them had accepted that the immediate danger, whatever it had been, had passed. As Mira gently touched her elbow and guided her toward a side exit, Elena glanced back once at the king. He was already speaking with his advisor, his posture rigid, his voice too low for her to hear the words, but the tension in his shoulders told her everything she needed to know. He was furious. He was hurt. And somehow, despite everything, despite the fear still hammering through her veins, some small and unwelcome part of her wanted to go back and understand why. She pushed the thought away, as Mira led her down a long corridor lined with tall windows, sunlight spilling across polished stone floors, in a way that felt entirely too peaceful for what had just happened. Mira walked quickly, glancing sideways at Elena every few steps, clearly curious, but too well trained to ask the questions Elena could see burning behind her eyes. "You're the first," Mira finally said, once they had turned down a quieter hallway. "In case no one told you, the first mate the king has ever had revealed to him. There have been rumors for years about whether he even had one, whether some kings just never do, and then you show up and reject him in front of the entire court." Elena's face burned. "I didn't plan it," she said. "It just came out." Mira's expression softened slightly, though there was still a note of disbelief in her voice. "Well, whatever the reason, you've certainly given the castle something to talk about for the next decade." She paused at a heavy wooden door, pushing it open to reveal a spacious room with a large bed, a writing desk, and windows overlooking a garden Elena had not expected to see inside castle walls. "This will be your room. There's a washroom through that door, and I'll bring you something to eat shortly. If you need anything else, just ring the bell by the bed." Elena stepped inside slowly, taking in the room that was larger and finer than anything she had ever slept in, and yet it felt suffocating, like a beautifully decorated cage. "Thank you," she said quietly, because it seemed like the only appropriate thing to say. Mira lingered at the door for a moment. "For what it's worth," she said, "he's not a cruel man. Strict, yes, guarded, always, but not cruel. Whatever you're afraid of, I don't think it's him." "Not really." Before Elena could respond, Mira was gone, the door clicking shut behind her, though notably not locking. Elena crossed to the window and looked out over the garden below, watching a pair of birds circle above a stone fountain, and tried to steady her racing thoughts. She thought of her pack, small and struggling, tucked into the hills 3 days' ride from the castle. She thought of her mother, who had begged her not to go to the coronation at all, some instinct warning her that nothing good could come of drawing attention to their family. She thought of the fire that had taken her childhood home, when she was only 8 years old, the flames ordered by an alpha who wanted her pack's territory, and had not cared how many lives it cost to take it. She had grown up believing that power, especially the kind held by an alpha king, was something to fear rather than trust. And yet, when she closed her eyes, she could still see the exact shade of gold that had burned in Damien's irises, could still feel the strange, undeniable pull that had struck her the moment their eyes met across the crowded hall. It was not something she could explain to herself, let alone to anyone else. She had rejected him out of pure instinct, out of years of buried fear rising up all at once, and now she was trapped in his castle, with no idea how to undo what she had done, or whether she even wanted to. A soft knock came at the door, and before Elena could answer, a guard's voice spoke through the wood, polite but firm. "Lady Elena, the king requests your presence in the private council chamber within the hour. He wishes to explain the terms of your stay." Elena's stomach twisted. "Terms," she repeated under her breath, staring at the door as though it might offer some answer. She thought of running, of trying to slip past the guards and disappear into the city beyond the castle walls, but she knew, with a bone-deep certainty that came from being a wolf her entire life, that no matter how far she ran, the bond humming faintly beneath her skin would never let her forget the man she had left behind, gold eyes burning, and doors locking shut around her. She sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, wrapping her arms around herself, and for the first time since the ceremony, allowed herself to admit the truth. She was not only afraid of the king, she was afraid of what she might come to feel for him, and whether that fear would end up costing her more than the rejection already had. The hour passed too quickly. When the same guard returned to escort her, Elena followed him through corridors that seemed to grow narrower and more formal the closer they came to the private council chamber, portraits of past kings watching her from gilded frames, as though judging her for what she had done. The guard stopped before a set of dark wooden doors and knocked twice before pushing them open. Damien was already inside, standing near a tall window with his back to the door, his crimson cloak gone now, replaced by a simple dark tunic that made him look, for the first time since she had seen him, almost ordinary, almost human. He turned as she entered, and though the gold in his eyes had faded back to a deep, unreadable brown, the intensity behind them had not lessened at all. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a chair near a long table, though his tone was not unkind. Elena sat stiffly, watching him with the wary attention of someone bracing for an attack that might come from any direction. Damien remained standing for a long moment, studying her in a way that made her want to look away, though she forced herself not to. "I owe you an explanation," he said finally, his voice quieter now than it had been in the throne hall. "The rejection you spoke is not something either of us can simply undo by ignoring it. Left alone, it will weaken us both, slowly at first, then all at once. There are rites, old ones, that can properly sever a bond if that is truly what you want, but they require time, and they require both of us to stand before the Pack Council and confirm the choice is final and understood." "And if I don't want to wait?" Elena asked. "If I want to leave now?" Something flickered across his face, gone before she could name it. "Then you would be free to try," he said, but I do not think you understand yet what a broken bond does to a wolf who leaves it unresolved. It is not simply heartache. It is a sickness that spreads through the body and the mind both. I have seen it kill." Elena's throat tightened. "Why does it matter to you?" she asked, unable to keep the challenge out of her voice. "You have a kingdom to run. Surely one rejected mate is not worth this much trouble." Damien's expression hardened, though not with anger. It was something closer to old, well-worn pain. "Because I have waited my entire life to know what this bond feels like," he said quietly. "And in the space of one moment, I felt it and lost it in the same breath. I do not intend to simply let that go without understanding why." Elena had no answer for that. She sat in silence, the weight of his words settling over her like a stone, and for the first time since the ceremony, she began to wonder if the golden-eyed king who had locked her inside his castle might be far more complicated, and far less monstrous, than the fear in her chest wanted him to be. Outside the window, the sun was beginning to set over the kingdom, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that matched, almost too perfectly, the fire she had seen burning in his eyes only hours before. Whatever came next, Elena understood now that there was no simple way out of the doors that had locked behind her. She would have to face whatever waited on the other side of her fear, whether she was ready or not. Elena woke the next morning to the sound of birds outside her window, and, for a brief and merciful moment, forgot where she was. Then the weight of the previous day came rushing back, and she sat up quickly, half expecting guards to be standing at the foot of her bed. The room was empty except for a tray of food someone had left on the writing desk, still warm, as though whoever brought it had only just left. A folded note sat beside the tray. She opened it with unsteady hands, and found a short message written in neat, careful handwriting. "You are not a prisoner here. The gardens are open to you before midday, and Mira will show you where you may walk freely." It was signed simply, Damien. Elena stared at the note for a long moment, unsure what to make of it. She had expected coldness, perhaps even cruelty, from a king she had humiliated in front of his entire court. Instead, she had received a gentle offer of freedom, however limited, and it unsettled her more than harsh words would have. Mira arrived shortly after, cheerful, despite the early hour, and helped Elena into simple but well-made clothing that felt strange against skin, used to rougher, homespun fabric. As they walked together through the quiet halls toward the garden, Mira chattered lightly about the castle staff, the kitchens, the strange habits of the older courtiers, clearly trying to put Elena at ease. "Does he often send notes like that?" Elena finally asked, cutting through Mira's conversation about a baker who refused to make anything but round loaves. Mira's steps slowed slightly. "Never," she admitted. "Not that I know of. The king is not exactly known for gentle gestures. He is fair, and he is just, but warmth is not a word most people would use to describe him." She glanced sideways at Elena with open curiosity. "Whatever you are to him, it seems to be bringing out a side of him the staff has never seen." They reached the garden, and Elena found herself momentarily distracted by its beauty. Rows of flowering shrubs and a stone path, winding beneath tall trees that provided cool, dappled shade. For the first time since arriving at the castle, she felt something like her own breath returning fully to her lungs. She spent the morning walking the garden paths alone, turning over everything that had happened since the coronation. The golden fire in Damien's eyes, the way the doors had locked, and then, just as strangely, unlocked. The rawness in his voice when he admitted he had waited his whole life for the bond she had rejected. None of it fit the picture she had built in her mind of what an alpha king should be, a picture shaped entirely by the destruction wrought by another alpha many years ago. She thought of her mother's warnings, urgent and fearful, though her mother had never fully explained why she distrusted those in power so deeply. Elena had always assumed it was simply the old fire, the loss of their first home, still haunting her mother's judgment. Now, walking through a garden she had no right to enjoy as a guest who was not truly free, she wondered if there was more to the story than she had ever been told. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft crunch of footsteps on the gravel path behind her. She turned, expecting Mira, and instead found herself face to face with Damien, dressed simply, without any of the ceremonial trappings of the crown, looking almost like an ordinary man out for a morning walk. "I did not expect to find you awake this early," he said, though his tone suggested he was pleased rather than surprised. "I did not expect to be allowed outside my room at all," Elena replied, unable to fully keep the edge out of her voice. Damien's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. I told you, this is not meant to be a punishment. I understand you did not choose any of this, and I do not intend to make your presence here feel like a cage, even if I cannot yet let you leave the grounds. They walked together in silence for a while, an uneasy but not entirely uncomfortable quiet settling between them. Elena studied him from the corner of her eye, searching for any trace of the golden fire from the day before, but his eyes remained their ordinary brown, calm and watchful. Why does the bond show itself like that? She finally asked. The eyes, the doors. I've never heard of anything like it. It is old magic, tied to the crown itself, Damien explained. Every ruler carries it, though most never live to see it triggered, since true mate bonds are rare, even among alphas. When the bond is threatened, whether by rejection or danger, the magic responds instinctively, trying to protect what it senses is vital to the bloodline and the kingdom's stability. It is not something I can control, not entirely. So it wasn't you locking the doors, Elena said slowly. It was some kind of instinct. Damien nodded. I did not choose to trap you there, if that is what worries you, though I understand why it must have felt that way. Elena considered this, turning the information over carefully. It did not erase her fear entirely, but it softened the sharp edges of it, made the memory of those locked doors feel less like a threat and more like the accidental consequence of forces neither of them fully understood. They continued walking, and gradually, without either of them quite intending it, the conversation shifted away from bonds and magic and toward smaller, simpler things. Damien asked about her pack, and Elena found herself describing the hills where she had grown up, the small stream that ran behind her family's home, the way her younger brother insisted on naming every stray animal that wandered into their territory. Damien listened with a focus that surprised her, asking questions that showed he was truly paying attention, rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. In return, though sparingly, he shared pieces of his own life, the crushing loneliness of being raised, knowing he would one day rule, the weight of expectations that had followed him since childhood, the strange emptiness of never quite trusting whether those around him valued him, or simply the power he would someday hold. Elena had not expected to feel any sympathy for a king, but something in the careful, guarded way he spoke about his own isolation struck a chord she recognized in herself. By the time Mira came to collect Elena for the midday meal, something subtle had shifted between them. Not trust exactly, not yet, but perhaps the smallest beginning of understanding. As Elena turned to leave, Damien spoke once more, his voice quieter than before. I know you have reasons for the fear I saw in your eyes yesterday, he said. I do not expect you to explain them to me yet, but I would like the chance to understand, when you are ready to share them. Elena did not answer immediately, uncertain what to say to an offer that felt both kind and dangerous in equal measure. Finally, she gave a small nod, neither a promise nor a refusal, simply an acknowledgement that the door between them, unlike the ones that had locked so violently the day before, had been left slightly open. As she followed Mira back into the castle, Elena found herself glancing back once toward the garden, where Damien remained standing among the flowering shrubs, watching her go with an expression she could not quite read. Whatever this bond truly was, whatever force had connected them so suddenly and so completely, Elena understood now that ignoring it, or running from it, was no longer as simple as she had believed the day before. That evening, as she sat alone in her room picking at a plate of food she had little appetite for, Elena allowed herself, for the first time, to wonder what might happen if she chose not to fight the bond at all, and the thought frightened her nearly as much as the golden fire in Damien's eyes had the day the doors slammed shut behind her. Days passed, and Elena settled, reluctantly, into a strange rhythm within the castle walls. Mornings were spent walking the gardens, sometimes alone, sometimes with Mira, and occasionally, when his duties allowed, with Damien himself. Afternoons brought quiet meals and long hours in the castle library, where Elena discovered a passion for reading she had never had the luxury to indulge back home. Evenings were the hardest, when the castle grew quiet, and her thoughts turned inevitably to the small, struggling pack she had left behind, and the mother who had begged her not to attend the coronation at all. It was during one of these long evenings that Elena finally allowed the old memories to surface fully, memories she had spent years pushing down and refusing to examine too closely. She had been 8 years old when the fire came. Her pack had lived peacefully in a valley 2 days' journey from where her family lived now, a territory rich with game and clean water, coveted by a nearby alpha who ruled with cruelty rather than justice. When her pack's elders refused to surrender their land, the alpha had not negotiated. He had attacked in the middle of the night, setting fire to the homes while families slept, and Elena remembered, with a clarity that still made her hands shake, the sight of golden firelight reflected in the eyes of wolves who had come to kill rather than protect. Her father had died that night, along with a dozen others, buying enough time for the survivors to flee into the surrounding forest. Elena's mother had carried her for miles, running until her legs gave out, and they had eventually found refuge with a smaller, weaker pack far to the north, the same pack Elena had grown up in and called home ever since. She had never spoken of that night to anyone outside her immediate family, and even within her family, it remained an unspoken wound, referenced only in careful, indirect ways. But sitting alone in her castle room, staring at the flickering candle on her desk, Elena understood for the first time why she had reacted the way she had, the moment Damien's eyes had turned gold before her. It was not truly him she feared. It was the memory of another alpha's burning eyes, watching her home turn to ash. A soft knock came at her door, and when she opened it, she found Damien standing in the hallway alone, without any guards or attendants, an unusual sight given how carefully his movements were typically watched by his court. "I heard from Mira that you seemed troubled this evening," he said, an uncharacteristic hesitance in his voice. I did not wish to intrude, but I found myself unable to simply ignore it. Elena hesitated, torn between the old instinct to keep her past locked away and a new, unfamiliar urge to finally let someone else carry part of the weight she had been holding alone for years. Finally, she stepped aside and allowed him into the room, and they sat together near the window as the last light of evening faded from the sky. Slowly, haltingly, Elena told him everything: the fire, her father's death, the years of running and rebuilding in a pack too small and too poor to ever fully recover. As she spoke, she watched Damien's expression carefully, bracing herself for pity, or worse, indifference. But instead, she found only a quiet, steady attentiveness, as though every word she spoke mattered to him. When she finished, silence stretched between them for a long moment before Damien finally spoke. "I am sorry," he said simply, his voice heavy with a sincerity that surprised her. "Sorry for what happened to your family, and sorry that my own eyes brought that memory back to you in the worst possible way. I understand now why you said what you did." Elena felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she had carried for so long she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be without it. "I don't think I truly understood it myself until tonight," she admitted. "I thought I was afraid of you. But I think I was afraid of becoming my mother, spending the rest of my life waiting for the next fire to come." Damien was quiet for a moment, considering her words carefully, before he spoke again. "I cannot promise you a life without danger," he said honestly. "Being tied to a crown means being tied to responsibilities and threats that never fully disappear. But I can promise you that I would never turn that fire against you, or against those you love. Whatever else you come to believe about me, I need you to know that." Elena studied him in the dim candlelight, searching his face for any sign of deception, and finding none. Slowly, cautiously, she allowed herself to believe him, at least in that moment, at least a little. Their conversation shifted, gradually growing lighter as the evening wore on. Damien told her, with surprising humor, about the disastrous early lessons he had received as a child, learning to control his shift, and Elena found herself laughing for the first time since arriving at the castle, a sound that seemed to visibly ease something in Damien's expression as well. It was nearly midnight when he finally rose to leave, and at the door, he paused, turning back to face her. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for trusting me with something so difficult. I know that could not have been easy." Elena offered a small, genuine smile, the first she had given him since the coronation. "Thank you for listening," she replied, and meaning it more than she expected to. After he left, Elena sat alone by the window for a long while, watching the moon rise over the castle grounds, and found herself thinking, with a mixture of surprise and quiet wonder, that the golden-eyed king who had locked the doors around her might be the first person outside her own family she had ever truly trusted with the worst night of her life. The following days brought a noticeable shift in the castle's atmosphere. Word had clearly spread among the staff that the king and his rejected mate had been seen walking together more frequently, laughing quietly in the gardens, sharing meals that stretched longer than necessary. Mira, ever observant, teased Elena gently about the change, though she never pushed too hard, seeming to understand instinctively that whatever was growing between Elena and Damien was still fragile, still finding its shape. But not everyone in the castle viewed this growing closeness with approval. Elena began to notice certain courtiers watching her, with expressions that ranged from open suspicion to poorly concealed hostility, whispers that fell silent whenever she passed, glances exchanged between members of the council that made her skin prickle with unease. She mentioned this to Mira one afternoon, expecting reassurance, but instead found the young woman's expression grow uncharacteristically serious. "There are those in the court who do not want the king to have a mate at all," Mira admitted quietly, glancing around to ensure they were not overheard. "An unmated king is easier to influence, easier to control through marriages of political convenience. A true mate bond threatens all of that." Elena felt a chill settle over her despite the warm afternoon sun. "Are you saying someone might try to interfere?" she asked. Mira's expression grew troubled. "I don't know for certain," she admitted. "But I would advise caution all the same. Not everyone in this castle wishes you well, Elena, and it would be wise to remember that, even as things between you and the king continue to grow." Elena carried Mira's warning with her for the rest of the day, a quiet unease settling beneath the fragile peace she had begun to find within the castle walls. She thought of the hostile glances, the whispered conversations that fell silent at her approach, and wondered, with a growing sense of dread, whether the true danger she faced in this place might not come from the bond itself, but from those determined to see it broken. The council chamber felt colder than usual the next morning, when Damien summoned his advisors for their weekly meeting, and Elena, invited for the first time to observe rather than remain in her quarters, sat quietly near the back of the room, watching the exchange unfold with growing unease. Lord Edwin, a stern-faced councilman with silver hair and a voice that carried easily across the chamber, was the first to speak against her, though he chose his words carefully, careful not to appear openly hostile in front of the king. "Your Majesty," he began, "we understand the significance of a true mate bond, and we do not question the old laws that protect it. But the girl comes from an unranked pack with no political standing, no alliances, no resources to offer the crown. Surely you understand the concerns some of us hold regarding the kingdom's stability, should this bond be confirmed." Elena felt her face flush with a mixture of embarrassment and anger, though she forced herself to remain silent, understanding that speaking out of turn in this setting would only worsen her position. Damien's expression hardened, and when he spoke, his voice carried an authority that silenced any further murmuring among the council. "The bond is not a political arrangement, Lord Edwin," he said firmly. "It is not mine to negotiate away for the sake of alliances or resources. If the old magic itself has chosen her, then it is not this council's place to question that choice." "With respect, Your Majesty," another councilwoman interjected, a sharp-featured woman named Beatrice, who Elena had noticed watching her with particular coldness since her arrival. "The old magic can be wrong. There have been cases, rare though they are, where bonds have been triggered falsely, under stress or fear, only to fade within weeks. Perhaps it would be wise to wait before granting the girl such privileged access to the crown." Elena felt the weight of every eye in the room shift toward her, and though Damien's expression remained carefully neutral, she saw the muscle in his jaw tighten, a sign, she was beginning to learn, that he was holding back a far sharper response than the diplomatic one he ultimately gave. "I appreciate the council's caution," he said evenly, "but the decision regarding Lady Elena's place in this castle remains mine, not this council's. I trust you all understand that." The meeting continued for another hour, moving through matters of trade agreements and border patrols that Elena struggled to follow, her mind still turning over the hostility she had witnessed from Lord Edwin and Lady Beatrice. When the council finally dispersed, Damien lingered behind, waiting until the chamber had emptied, before turning to Elena with an apologetic expression. "I am sorry you had to witness that," he said. "I should have prepared you better for how some of my council views this situation." Elena shook her head slowly, though the unease Mira had planted in her the day before had only deepened. "Is it always like this?" she asked. Do they always fight you so openly? Damien's expression grew troubled. Not usually so openly, he admitted, which concerns me more than their words themselves. Lord Edwin and Lady Beatrice have never been close allies, yet they seemed remarkably united today in their opposition to you. That is not a coincidence I feel comfortable ignoring. That evening, as Elena walked alone through a quieter section of the castle gardens, lost in thought, she noticed a figure watching her from beneath the shadow of a large tree near the garden wall. She stopped, her wolf instincts immediately alert, and studied the figure carefully until it stepped forward into the fading light, revealing itself to be a young guard she did not recognize. "Lady Elena," he said, his voice carrying an odd, careful politeness that immediately put her on edge. "A word, if I may." Elena remained where she stood, unwilling to close the distance between them. "Who are you?" she asked. The guard's expression flickered, something calculating passing behind his eyes, before he masked it with a respectful smile. "My name is not important," he said. "I simply wish to offer you a piece of advice, for your own safety. The bond you carry with the king is not welcomed by everyone in this castle. There are those who would see it broken, one way or another, and I would hate to see you caught in the middle of a conflict that is not truly yours." Elena's pulse quickened, though she kept her expression carefully guarded. "Is that a threat?" she asked. "A warning," the guard corrected smoothly. "Perhaps it would be wise to consider whether remaining here is truly worth the danger it invites, both for yourself and for your family back home." The mention of her family sent a cold jolt of fear through Elena's chest, and before she could respond, the guard turned and disappeared into the shadows of the garden, leaving her alone with her racing heart and a growing certainty that Mira's warnings had been justified. She reported the encounter to Damien immediately, finding him still awake in his private study, poring over documents by candlelight. His expression darkened as she recounted the guard's words, and by the time she finished, he had already risen from his desk, his posture rigid with barely restrained anger. "Describe him to me," Damien said, his voice low and controlled in a way that somehow felt more dangerous than shouting would have. Elena did her best, though the guard's face had been partially obscured by shadow, and Damien listened carefully, his expression growing increasingly troubled as she spoke. "I will have the castle guard rosters checked immediately," he said once she finished. "If there is a guard matching that description who should not have had access to the gardens at that hour, I will find him. But Elena, I need you to understand that threats against your family are not something I take lightly. I will assign additional protection to your pack immediately, and I will not rest until I understand who is behind this." Elena felt a rush of gratitude mixed with lingering fear, watching as Damien moved quickly to summon guards and dispatch messengers, his focus entirely consumed by ensuring her family's safety. Despite everything, despite the fear that had brought her to this castle in the first place, she found herself trusting him completely in that moment, trusting that whatever conspiracy was forming against their bond, he would fight against it with everything he had. As the castle fell into a flurry of quiet, urgent activity around them, Elena remained standing near the study window, staring out at the darkened gardens where the mysterious guard had disappeared, and understood, with growing certainty, that the danger threatening their bond was no longer a distant possibility. It had arrived, and it was closer than either of them had realized. The days following the encounter in the garden brought a heightened sense of caution throughout the castle. Damien doubled the guard rotation around Elena's quarters, and though she chafed slightly at the increased scrutiny, she understood, better than most, exactly what kind of danger careless trust could invite. Messengers had been sent to her family's pack with additional protection, and though no word had yet returned confirming their safety, Damien assured her repeatedly that his fastest riders had been dispatched. Despite the tension hanging over the castle, a diplomatic dinner had been planned for weeks prior, an event that could not be postponed without raising uncomfortable questions among the visiting dignitaries from a neighboring territory. Damien insisted, gently but firmly, that Elena attend by his side, explaining that hiding her away now would only feed the rumors already circulating about the strength, or supposed weakness, of their bond. Elena stood nervously in her room that evening as Mira helped her into a deep green gown that felt far too elegant for someone who had spent most of her life in simple, practical clothing. "You look every bit the part of a king's mate," Mira said warmly, adjusting the fabric at Elena's shoulders with careful hands. "I don't feel like it," Elena admitted, studying her reflection with a mixture of uncertainty and something that might have been the beginning of confidence. "That will come," Mira said with a reassuring smile. "Confidence is not something you're born with. It's something you build, one uncomfortable evening at a time." The dining hall glittered with candlelight when Elena entered on Damien's arm. The long table filled with dignitaries dressed in fine silks and jewels, their conversation pausing briefly as the king and his rejected mate took their seats at the head of the table. Elena felt every eye in the room, evaluating her, weighing her worth against the crown she now sat beside, and she forced herself to sit straighter, to meet the curious gazes with as much composure as she could manage. The meal progressed smoothly at first, filled with polite conversation about trade routes and territorial boundaries that Elena mostly listened to rather than participated in. But as the evening wore on, one of the visiting dignitaries, a sharp-tongued noblewoman from a neighboring kingdom, turned her attention pointedly toward Elena. "Tell me, Lady Elena," the noblewoman said, her tone dripping with false pleasantness, "is it true that you rejected the king in front of his entire court? Such a scandal must have been terribly embarrassing for His Majesty." The table fell into an uncomfortable hush, and Elena felt her face flush with heat, uncertain how to respond to such a direct and public challenge. Beside her, she felt Damien tense, though before he could intervene, Elena found her own voice, steadier than she expected. "It was a moment of fear, not malice," she said carefully, choosing her words with more confidence than she felt. "I imagine anyone would find it overwhelming to have their entire life changed in the span of a single breath, in front of an audience of strangers. I have since come to understand the bond, and His Majesty, far better than I did that day." A murmur of surprised approval rippled through the table, and Elena caught Damien glancing at her, with an expression of quiet pride that warmed something in her chest. The noblewoman, apparently satisfied that she had extracted an interesting story, regardless of its resolution, moved on to other topics, and the tension around the table gradually eased. Later, as the guests began to disperse into smaller conversations throughout the hall, Damien leaned close to Elena, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You handled that beautifully," he said, something warm and admiring in his tone. "I do not think I could have responded so gracefully myself." Elena allowed herself a small smile, still riding the adrenaline of having navigated such a public challenge successfully. "I surprised myself," she admitted honestly. As the evening wound down, Damien guided her toward a quieter corner of the hall, away from the remaining guests, and for a while they simply stood together, watching the candlelight flicker across the polished floor. It was in this quiet moment that Damien finally opened up in a way he had not before, his guard lowering just enough to reveal glimpses of the isolation that had shaped him. "I have never had anyone stand beside me the way you did tonight," he admitted quietly. "My entire life, I have been surrounded by people who wanted something from the crown, rarely anyone who simply wanted to stand with me, without expectation of gain. Even my own council, as loyal as some of them are, view me primarily as a position to be managed, rather than a person to be understood." Elena listened carefully, hearing the loneliness beneath his measured words, and felt something shift within her, a growing understanding that the powerful Alpha King she had once feared was, beneath the crown and the golden fire in his eyes, someone who had spent his entire life quietly starved for genuine connection. "That must be a heavy way to live," she said softly. "It is," Damien admitted, "which is perhaps why the bond struck me so hard the moment I saw you. For the first time in my life, something ancient and undeniable told me that I was not meant to carry this weight entirely alone." Elena felt her chest tighten with an emotion she was not yet ready to name, something caught between fear and longing, and though she did not respond immediately, she found herself reaching out, almost without thinking, to gently touch his arm. Damien went still at the contact, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken, though this time the reaction stirring within her was not fear. "I am beginning to understand," she said quietly, "why the bond chose you." The moment stretched between them, fragile and charged, until the sound of approaching footsteps forced them apart, a guard hurrying toward Damien with an urgent expression that immediately shattered the tenderness of the moment. "Your Majesty," the guard said breathlessly, "we have received word from the messengers sent to Lady Elena's pack. There has been an incident." Elena's heart dropped, fear flooding back in an instant, as she gripped Damien's arm tightly. "What kind of incident?" she demanded, her voice tight with panic. The guard hesitated, glancing briefly at Damien before answering. An attempted attack on the pack's territory, he said. Repelled successfully, thanks to the additional guards sent ahead of time, but the attackers left no survivors to question, and no clear indication of who ordered the assault. Elena felt the room spin slightly around her, and Damien's arm immediately came around her shoulders, steady and grounding, as the full weight of the danger surrounding their bond crashed over her once more. Whatever fragile peace she had begun to find within the castle walls, it was clear now that the conspiracy threatening their bond had grown far more dangerous than either of them had anticipated, and the people she loved most were no longer safe simply by being far away from the castle. "We will find whoever is responsible," Damien said firmly, his voice steady despite the tension radiating through his body. "I promise you that, Elena, whatever it takes." Elena nodded, though the fear coiled tightly in her chest did not fully ease, even as she allowed herself to lean, however briefly, into the strength and steadiness of the man beside her, understanding now more than ever that their fates and their safety had become inseparably intertwined. In the days following the attack on her family's territory, Elena threw herself into helping however she could, sitting in on council meetings despite the lingering hostility from certain members, poring over maps and reports with Damien, late into the night, as they searched for any clue that might reveal who had ordered the assault. The attackers, all confirmed dead in the skirmish, carried no identifying marks, no insignia, nothing that could easily trace them back to a specific pack or faction. But Damien was not willing to let the trail go cold so easily. It was Mira, surprisingly, who first noticed the pattern that would eventually crack the conspiracy open. Working quietly in the background, gathering information from her network of contacts among the castle staff, she approached Elena one afternoon with an expression of carefully controlled excitement. "I've been listening," she said, pulling Elena aside into a quiet alcove, away from prying ears. Two of the kitchen staff mentioned overhearing Lord Edwin's personal guard discussing payments made to outside parties, payments that were never logged through official castle channels. "I think Lord Edwin may be more involved in this than anyone realizes." Elena's blood ran cold. "Are you certain?" she asked. "Not certain enough to accuse him outright," Mira admitted, "but certain enough that I thought you and the king should know." Elena brought the information to Damien immediately, and though he received it with the same careful skepticism he applied to all unconfirmed reports, she could see the way his expression darkened at the mention of Lord Edwin's name, as though some suspicion he had been quietly nursing had finally found confirmation. "I have long wondered about Edwin's loyalty," he admitted, pacing the length of his study as he processed the information. "He has never fully accepted the old laws regarding mate bonds, has always argued that political marriages serve the kingdom better than what he considers old-fashioned superstition. If he believes breaking our bond would restore his preferred order, he may well be desperate enough to act against it directly." "What do we do?" Elena asked. "We watch," Damien said firmly, "carefully, and without revealing our suspicions. If Edwin believes himself undetected, he may grow careless enough to reveal his full involvement, and any allies working alongside him." The plan required patience that tested Elena's nerves daily, forcing her to sit through council meetings and castle events beside Lord Edwin, maintaining a careful facade of ignorance, while every instinct screamed at her to confront him directly. But she trusted Damien's judgment, understanding that acting too quickly, without solid proof, would only allow the true conspirators to slip further into hiding. The opportunity Damien had been waiting for arrived nearly 2 weeks later, when a moonlit hunt was organized as part of a traditional castle celebration, an event where members of the court, including Elena, were invited to run through the surrounding forest in their wolf forms, a rare and cherished freedom that Elena had genuinely been looking forward to after weeks of confinement within castle walls. The forest was beautiful under the full moon, silver light filtering through the canopy, as wolves of every size and color raced between the trees, the pure joy of the run temporarily washing away the tension that had gripped Elena for weeks. She ran alongside Damien for much of the evening, their wolves moving in an easy, natural rhythm that felt like the truest expression of the bond between them, unburdened by politics or fear. It was during a brief separation, when Elena had paused near a small stream to drink, that the attack came. 3 wolves emerged suddenly from the shadows, moving with a coordinated precision that immediately told her this was no accidental encounter. She had only a moment to shift into a defensive stance before they were upon her, teeth bared, clearly intent on capturing rather than killing. Elena fought with everything she had, years of pack training finally proving their worth, as she twisted away from one attacker's jaws and raked her claws across another's flank. But she was outnumbered, and she felt herself being slowly forced backward toward a narrow ravine, her strength beginning to flag under the relentless assault. Then, through the chaos, she heard it, a roar that seemed to shake the very trees around them, and Damien burst through the underbrush in his full wolf form, larger and more powerful than any wolf Elena had ever seen, his eyes blazing with the same golden fire she had witnessed at the coronation. He tore into the attackers with a ferocity that spoke of pure, unrestrained protective instinct, and within moments, 2 of the 3 attackers lay defeated, the third fleeing into the darkness before Damien could reach him. Elena, injured and shaking, felt Damien shift back to his human form beside her, his hands immediately checking her over for wounds, his expression a mixture of fury and barely restrained panic. "I'm all right," she managed to say, though the deep gash along her shoulder told a different story, blood soaking through what remained of her torn clothing. "You are not all right," Damien said, his voice tight with emotion, as he gathered her carefully into his arms, moving quickly back toward the castle. "You could have died tonight." "But I didn't," she said softly, exhaustion beginning to overtake the adrenaline that had carried her through the fight. "Because you came." Damien's arms tightened around her protectively, and though he said nothing further, as he carried her swiftly through the forest toward the castle's healing quarters, Elena felt, even through the pain and exhaustion, the depth of his fear for her safety, a fear that spoke louder than any words could have about exactly how much she had come to mean to him. The castle's healer worked quickly once they arrived, cleaning and stitching the wound along Elena's shoulder, while Damien paced anxiously nearby, refusing to leave her side despite the healer's gentle suggestions that he rest. When the treatment was finally complete and Elena lay resting in the infirmary bed, exhaustion pulling at the edges of her consciousness, Damien finally sat down beside her, taking her hand gently in his. "I should have anticipated this," he said quietly, guilt heavy in his voice. "I should have kept you closer." Elena squeezed his hand weakly, though her voice remained steady. "You couldn't have known," she said, "and you came for me the moment it mattered." Damien was quiet for a long moment, studying their joined hands as though searching for the right words. "I have spent my entire life believing that showing weakness, showing how much someone mattered to me, would only make me vulnerable," he admitted finally. "Tonight, watching you fight for your life, I understood how wrong that belief truly was. Protecting what matters most is not weakness. It is the greatest strength I have ever felt." Elena felt tears sting at the corners of her eyes, exhaustion and emotion tangling together as she looked up at him, seeing past the crown and the golden fire to the man who had risked everything to reach her in time. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not being who I feared you were." As sleep finally began to claim her, Elena felt Damien press a gentle kiss to her forehead, his voice barely above a whisper, as he spoke words she was almost too tired to hear clearly. "I will keep you safe," he promised. "Whatever it takes, whoever stands against us, I will not let anyone take you from me again." Elena's recovery took nearly a week, during which Damien visited her daily, often staying long past what his duties strictly allowed, reading to her from old books in the castle library, or simply sitting quietly beside her bed while she rested. The attack in the forest had changed something fundamental between them, stripping away the last remnants of formal distance that had lingered even through their growing closeness. It was during one of these quiet afternoons, sunlight streaming through the infirmary windows, that Elena finally found the courage to voice the confession that had been building within her since the night of the attack. "I need to tell you something," she said, watching Damien carefully as he looked up from the book he had been reading aloud. "My rejection, that day at the coronation, it wasn't really about you at all." Damien set the book aside, giving her his full attention. "I had begun to suspect as much," he admitted gently, "but I would like to hear it from you, if you're ready to share it." Elena took a steadying breath and told him, in full detail this time, about the fire that had destroyed her childhood home, about the golden-eyed alpha who had ordered the attack, about the years of fear that had shaped her into someone who instinctively recoiled from power, rather than trusting it. She told him about her mother's warnings, about the deep, bone-level terror that had gripped her the moment his eyes had turned gold before the entire court, a color that had, in that instant, dragged her straight back into the worst night of her childhood. "I wasn't rejecting you," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "I was rejecting the fear I saw reflected in your eyes, a fear I didn't even realize I was still carrying until it was too late to stop the words from coming out." Damien listened to every word with a quiet, steady attention that made Elena feel, for the first time in her life, truly heard, rather than simply tolerated. When she finished, he reached out and gently took her hand, his thumb tracing careful circles across her knuckles. "Thank you for trusting me with that," he said softly. "I understand now, more fully than before, exactly what courage it took for you to walk through those castle doors that day, knowing everything you carried with you. There is something I should tell you as well," he continued after a moment, his expression growing more serious. "When I felt the bond snap into place that day, I understood immediately what a gift it was. I could have used the old laws to force the connection, to compel you to remain bonded regardless of your wishes. Many kings before me have done exactly that, prioritizing the stability of the bond over the willingness of their mate. I chose not to do that, even in my anger and hurt at your rejection, because I could not bear the thought of forcing someone to love me who did not choose it freely." Elena felt her throat tighten with emotion at this admission, understanding fully now the depth of restraint and respect Damien had shown her from the very beginning, even in the face of a public humiliation that would have justified far harsher treatment. "You could have forced it," she said slowly, processing the weight of what he had just revealed. "And you chose not to. I could not build a life with someone who did not choose me back," he said simply, even if that meant risking the bond itself. Something shifted fully within Elena in that moment, the last remnants of her old fear dissolving into something warmer and far more certain. She realized, with sudden clarity, that the trust she had been slowly building with Damien over the past weeks had grown into something deeper, something that no longer felt uncertain or fragile, but solid and true. "I choose you," she said quietly, the words feeling both terrifying and entirely right as she spoke them. "Not because the bond demands it, and not out of fear of what might happen if I refuse. I choose you because I have come to know you, truly know you, and what I know, I trust completely." Damien's expression shifted, surprise giving way to something raw and deeply moved, his eyes searching hers as though he could hardly believe what he had just heard. "Elena," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "do you understand what you are saying?" "I do," she said firmly, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "I am saying that I want this bond, fully and completely, not because it was forced upon me, but because I have chosen it with clear eyes and an open heart." Damien leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished, and when she did not, he closed the remaining distance between them and kissed her gently, a kiss that carried within it weeks of careful patience and growing trust, finally allowed to bloom into something undeniable. Elena felt the bond between them settle more fully into place, no longer the frightening, overwhelming force it had been at the coronation, but something warm and steady, a connection she now understood she had wanted, perhaps, from the very first moment their eyes had met across the crowded hall. When they finally parted, Damien rested his forehead gently against hers, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have waited my entire life for this," he admitted, "and I would have waited a lifetime longer, if that was what you needed." Elena smiled softly, a genuine, unguarded smile that felt entirely new on her face. "I'm glad you didn't have to wait quite that long," she said. Their quiet moment was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps approaching the infirmary, and both of them straightened slightly as Mira entered, her expression carrying a mixture of urgency and barely contained anger. "Your Majesty," she said breathlessly, "we've found proof. Lord Edwin's personal seal was discovered on documents recovered from one of the attackers killed during the forest ambush. There's no longer any doubt about his involvement." Damien's expression hardened instantly, the warmth of the previous moment giving way to the cold resolve of a king facing betrayal from within his own council. "Bring him to the throne hall," he said, his voice carrying an authority that left no room for argument. It is time this conspiracy came to an end, fully and completely. As Damien rose to leave, already shifting into the focused, commanding presence of the ruler Elena had first seen at the coronation, she felt a surge of protective determination rise within her as well. Whatever confrontation awaited them in the throne hall, she understood now that she would face it not as a frightened outsider, but as someone standing firmly beside the king she had chosen, ready to defend the bond and the future they had begun, together, to build. The throne hall, so grand and imposing during the coronation, felt entirely different this time as Elena walked beside Damien toward the raised platform, the same doors that had once locked so violently, now standing open behind them, guarded by loyal soldiers rather than sealed by uncontrolled magic. Word of Lord Edwin's arrest had spread quickly through the castle, and members of the court had gathered along the edges of the hall, murmuring among themselves as guards escorted the councilman forward, his hands bound, his expression a mixture of defiance and barely concealed panic. Lady Beatrice stood nearby as well, flanked by guards, her earlier hostility, replaced now by a carefully controlled fear that suggested she understood exactly how precarious her own position had become. Evidence gathered over the past days, including testimony from castle staff and documents recovered from the failed attack, had implicated her, alongside Lord Edwin, revealing a conspiracy that had been building for far longer than anyone initially suspected. Damien ascended the platform slowly, his presence commanding the full attention of the hall, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority, tempered by careful restraint. "Lord Edwin," he began, "you stand accused of conspiring to break the mate bond recognized by this kingdom's oldest laws, of ordering an attack against Lady Elena's family, and of orchestrating an assault meant to capture or kill my chosen mate during the sacred hunt. What do you say in your defense?" Lord Edwin's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Elena thought he might deny everything outright. Instead, he lifted his chin with a defiance that bordered on desperation. "I did what I believed necessary for this kingdom's future," he said, his voice carrying across the silent hall. "A king bound to an unranked, powerless mate weakens our position among the neighboring territories. I sought only to protect the stability of the crown." "You sought to protect your own influence over that crown," Damien replied, his voice cold and precise. "Do not dress ambition in the language of duty, Lord Edwin. The old laws exist precisely to prevent men like you from manipulating the succession for personal gain." Lady Beatrice, when questioned, offered less resistance, her earlier composure crumbling entirely, as she admitted her role in providing information about Elena's movements to the hired attackers, though she maintained, tearfully, that she had never intended for anyone to be killed, only for the bond to be sufficiently disrupted that it would fade on its own. Elena watched the proceedings with a strange, complicated mixture of emotions, the fear and uncertainty of the past weeks, giving way now to a kind of quiet resolve. She stepped forward, surprising both the court and Damien himself, and addressed Lord Edwin directly. "You call me powerless," she said, her voice steady, despite the hundreds of eyes now fixed upon her. "But I have survived the destruction of my first home, rebuilt a life from nothing alongside my family, and stood beside a king through conspiracy and violence without breaking. Power is not measured only in rank or wealth, Lord Edwin. Sometimes it is measured in the strength to endure, and to choose trust even when fear would be the easier path." A murmur of surprised approval rippled through the gathered court, and Elena caught sight of Mira near the edge of the crowd, offering her a small, proud smile. Damien, too, regarded her with open admiration, though his focus quickly returned to the matter of justice awaiting resolution. The decision regarding punishment weighed heavily on Damien, and Elena watched him wrestle visibly with the choice before him, torn between the harsh justice his position demanded and a desire to show mercy that might, in some small way, prevent further division within his court. Ultimately, he chose a path that balanced both, stripping Lord Edwin and Lady Beatrice of their titles and lands, exiling them from the kingdom's borders permanently, while sparing them the more severe punishments that pack law would have permitted for their crimes. Mercy, when earned through honesty rather than manipulation, strengthens a kingdom more than cruelty ever could, Damien announced to the assembled court, his gaze sweeping across the gathered faces with quiet authority. "Let this be a lesson to any who would consider conspiring against the crown's rightful bonds in the future. Such actions will always be uncovered, and justice, however tempered by mercy, will always follow." As the guards led the two disgraced counselors from the hall, the remaining courtiers began to disperse, quiet conversations breaking out, as the shock of the morning's revelations settled into something more like relief, that the conspiracy, at last, had reached its resolution. Damien descended the platform and crossed to where Elena stood, taking her hand gently in his despite the watchful eyes still lingering throughout the hall. "You handled that with more grace than I could have managed myself," he said quietly, echoing words he had spoken once before, though this time the sentiment carried a depth of admiration that had grown considerably since their first tentative days together. "I had a good example to follow," Elena replied, glancing meaningfully toward the throne where he had so recently stood delivering judgment with both firmness and compassion. As the hall gradually emptied, leaving only a few trusted advisors and Mira lingering nearby, Damien turned to face Elena fully, his expression growing more serious, though something warm and hopeful lingered beneath the gravity of his tone. "With this conspiracy resolved," he said, "there remains only one matter left unfinished between us, the bond itself. You told me, in the infirmary, that you choose me freely. I would like to give you the opportunity to declare that choice formally, before the full Pack Council, if that is truly what you want." Elena felt her heart swell with a certainty that had been building steadily since that quiet conversation in the infirmary, a certainty that no longer wavered beneath old fears or lingering doubts. "I would like nothing more," she said, her voice clear and unshaking. Damien's answering smile was unlike any expression she had seen from him before, unguarded and full of a joy that seemed to erase, if only for a moment, every burden his crown typically demanded he carry. "Then let us not delay any further," he said. "The kingdom, and I believe your own heart as well, has waited long enough." As word began to spread throughout the castle that a formal bonding ceremony would soon be announced, Elena felt the last remnants of the fear that had once driven her to reject this very man, finally settle into something entirely different, a quiet, steady peace that came not from the absence of danger, but from having faced it, together, and emerged stronger for having done so. The days leading up to the formal bonding ceremony passed in a blur of preparation, the castle transforming under the careful direction of staff, eager to see their king finally settled with a mate the entire kingdom had come to accept, even admire, following the dramatic unraveling of Lord Edwin's conspiracy. Elena found herself swept along in the excitement, though beneath the flurry of fittings and ceremonial preparations, she carried a quiet, steady resolve that felt entirely different from the fear and uncertainty that had once defined her days within these walls. Word had finally arrived from her family's pack as well, confirming that they remained safe under the additional protection Damien had arranged, and more than that, extending an invitation for her mother and younger brother to attend the ceremony itself, an invitation that filled Elena with a joy she had not expected to feel so completely. Her mother arrived 3 days before the ceremony, and their reunion in the castle courtyard brought tears to both their eyes, months of separation and fear, finally giving way to relief and quiet celebration. Elena's mother studied her carefully as they embraced, searching her daughter's face with the particular attentiveness of a parent who had once feared she might never see her child again. "You look different," her mother said finally, cupping Elena's face gently in her weathered hands. "Lighter, somehow. Happier than I have seen you in years." "I am happier," Elena admitted, glancing toward the castle, where Damien remained occupied with final preparations for the ceremony. "It took me a long time to understand why, but I am." Her mother's expression grew thoughtful, and later that evening, as they sat together in Elena's chambers, she finally shared the fuller story behind her own deep-seated fear of powerful alphas, a story Elena had never fully understood until now. It turned out her mother's caution had run deeper than simply the loss of their home, rooted also in her own difficult history with an alpha who had once demanded loyalty through fear, rather than earning it through trust, long before the fire that had ultimately destroyed their first pack. "I never wanted that fear passed on to you," her mother admitted quietly. "But I see now that I did exactly that, without ever fully explaining why. I am sorry for that, Elena. Watching you these past few days, watching how the king treats you, how he earned your trust rather than demanding it, I understand now that not every powerful alpha carries the same darkness I once feared." Elena took her mother's hand gently, understanding fully now the weight of fear that had shaped both their lives, and grateful, deeply grateful, that she had found the courage to move beyond it. He is different, she said softly. And I am glad you will finally see that for yourself. The morning of the ceremony arrived bright and clear, the entire castle grounds decorated with flowers and banners, in the deep crimson and gold that represented the kingdom's colors. Elena stood in her chambers, as Mira helped her into a gown far more elaborate than anything she had worn before, pale gold fabric that seemed to catch and hold the morning light. A deliberate choice, Mira explained with a knowing smile, to honor the color that had first marked the bond between Elena and her king. You are ready, Mira said finally, stepping back to admire her work, her eyes glistening slightly with emotion. I have never seen anyone transform quite as beautifully as you have these past months, Elena, not just in appearance, but in spirit. Elena studied her own reflection, hardly recognizing the composed, confident woman staring back at her, so different from the terrified girl who had once fled the throne hall in fear after speaking words she had never fully understood the weight of. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion, for everything you've done to help me find my way here. The ceremony itself took place in the same throne hall where everything had begun, though the atmosphere could not have felt more different from that first fateful day. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows rather than the tense shadows of the coronation, and the assembled court watched not with suspicion or curiosity, but with genuine warmth and anticipation, as Elena walked slowly down the center aisle toward the platform where Damien waited. He wore simple ceremonial robes rather than the heavy formal attire of the coronation, and when their eyes met across the length of the hall, Elena saw none of the golden fire that had once frightened her so deeply. Instead, his eyes remained warm and steady, brown and familiar, filled with a quiet joy that mirrored the emotion swelling within her own chest. When she reached the platform, the Pack Council elder who presided over such ceremonies stepped forward, addressing the gathered court with the formal words that had marked bonding ceremonies for generations. Elena listened carefully, her hand held firmly within Damien's, until finally the moment arrived for her to speak the words that would confirm, freely and completely, the bond she had once rejected in fear. I, Elena Voss, she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying easily across the silent hall, do freely and fully accept the bond between myself and Damien Ashford, king of this realm. I choose him, not because ancient magic demands it, but because I have come to know his heart, and found within it a place I am honored to call home. As she finished speaking, the same golden light that had once burned with fury in Damien's eyes returned now, though entirely transformed, glowing softly rather than blazing, a warm and steady light that seemed to fill the entire hall with a gentle radiance. The doors at the back of the chamber, rather than slamming shut as they once had, swung open wide, sunlight streaming through, in a symbolic gesture that the pack elder explained represented the bond's full and willing completion, no longer trapping anyone, but welcoming instead the full openness of a partnership freely chosen. Damien's answering smile, as he drew Elena close and pressed a gentle kiss to her lips before the entire gathered court, held none of the guarded uncertainty that had once defined him, replaced instead by a joy so complete it seemed to transform his entire bearing. The kingdom erupted into celebration, cheers and applause filling the hall, as the newly confirmed bond was announced formally to the court and, by extension, to the entire realm beyond the castle walls. Elena, surrounded by well-wishers and the warm embraces of her family, Mira, and the many staff members who had supported her throughout her difficult transition into castle life, felt a peace settle over her that she had never known possible. Later that evening, as the celebrations continued in the great hall below, Elena and Damien slipped away together, to the same garden where their quiet friendship had first begun to take root, the same fountain where they had shared their first honest conversations, now bathed in the soft light of evening stars. Do you remember, Damien said softly, standing close beside her as they looked out over the peaceful grounds, when you told me you didn't know if you could ever trust someone with power? I remember, Elena said, leaning into him comfortably, a gesture that would have felt impossible just months before. And now, he asked, a gentle teasing note in his voice, what do you believe? Elena turned to face him fully, her heart full and steady, free at last from the fear that had once defined her every choice. Now I believe, she said softly, that the right kind of power is not something to fear at all. It is something to build a life beside, carefully, honestly, and with a trust that only grows stronger the more it is tested. Damien's expression softened into something deeply tender, and as he drew her close beneath the starlit sky, the golden warmth of the bond settling fully and peacefully between them, Elena understood that the doors which had once locked so violently around her fear now stood open in every sense that mattered, leading not to a cage, but to a home she had never expected to find, and now would not trade for anything in the world. Several months passed after the bonding ceremony, and the castle Elena had once entered as a frightened stranger had slowly, steadily become something she now called home, without hesitation. She had thrown herself into learning the responsibilities that came with standing beside a king, studying alongside Damien's most trusted advisors, listening carefully as he explained the histories and traditions of a kingdom she was now bound to help guide. The council, reshaped following the departure of Lord Edwin and Lady Beatrice, had grown noticeably warmer toward her, several members even seeking her counsel directly on matters where her perspective, shaped by years within a small and struggling pack, offered insights the wealthier, more established counselors often overlooked. Elena found unexpected satisfaction in advocating for smaller, unranked packs throughout the kingdom, using her position to secure resources and protections that had long been denied to communities like the one she had grown up in. Damien, too, had changed in subtle but meaningful ways since the ceremony. The guarded isolation that had once defined him had softened considerably, replaced by an openness that his advisors, though initially startled by the shift, had come to genuinely appreciate. He laughed more easily now, Elena noticed, and the quiet loneliness that had once shadowed his every interaction had given way to a steadiness that seemed to radiate outward, strengthening not just their bond, but his relationship with the kingdom he ruled. Her family had relocated closer to the castle at Damien's insistence. Their small pack granted new territory within a day's ride rather than 3, close enough that Elena could visit regularly, and her mother, in particular, had blossomed within the added security and resources the move provided. Watching her mother finally set aside decades of fear, laughing freely during visits to the castle gardens, brought Elena a joy she had never expected to feel so completely. It was during one such visit, as the whole family gathered in the castle courtyard to celebrate her younger brother's birthday, that Elena found a quiet moment alone with Damien, watching the celebration unfold around them, with a contentment that still occasionally surprised her with its depth. "I never imagined this," she admitted softly, watching her brother chase a group of castle children across the courtyard grass, her mother's laughter carrying warmly through the afternoon air. "Not the life I have now, not the person I've become." Damien wrapped an arm gently around her shoulders, drawing her close. "Neither did I," he admitted. "I spent so many years believing that ruling alone was simply the price of the crown I carried. I never imagined I would find someone who would not only stand beside me, but would help me become a better king in the process." Elena smiled, resting her head against his shoulder as the celebration continued around them, children's laughter mixing with the gentle music of a small ensemble the castle staff had arranged for the occasion. "We helped each other," she said quietly. "That's what I've come to understand these past months. Neither of us needed saving exactly. We simply needed someone willing to see us clearly, fears and all, and choose to stay anyway." As the sun began to set over the kingdom, painting the sky in soft shades of gold that no longer carried any trace of the fear those colors had once stirred within her, Elena felt a deep and settled peace, the kind that comes not from the absence of hardship, but from having weathered it fully, together, and emerged with a bond stronger for every trial it had faced. Later that evening, after the celebrations had wound down, and her family had retired to the guest quarters prepared for their visit, Elena stood with Damien on the same balcony, overlooking the gardens where they had shared so many quiet, formative conversations throughout their journey together. The stars stretched brightly overhead, and the castle below hummed with the peaceful quiet of a kingdom finally settled and secure. "Do you ever think about that day?" Damien asked softly, "the coronation, and everything that followed?" "Often," Elena admitted, "but not with fear anymore. I think about it now as the beginning of something I could never have predicted, something far better than the frightened assumptions I once carried about what power and love could truly mean." Damien turned to face her fully, his eyes holding none of the golden fire that had once seemed so threatening, warm instead, with a steady devotion that had only deepened with each passing month. "I love you," he said simply, the words carrying a weight and sincerity that still, even now, made Elena's heart swell with quiet wonder. "I love you too," she replied, and meant it completely, without a trace of the fear that had once defined her understanding of what those words, and the bond behind them, could mean. As they stood together beneath the star-filled sky, the kingdom peaceful and secure around them, the golden light of their bond settled gently between them one final time, no longer a mark of fury or fear, but a quiet, constant reminder of everything they had built together, choice by choice, trust by hard-won trust. The doors that had once locked so violently around Elena's fear had, in the end, opened onto a life she would never have imagined for herself. A life built not on the demands of ancient magic, but on the far stronger foundation of two hearts that had chosen, freely and completely, to belong to one another.